Welcome. I want to talk to you about one of the rules that we have at marriagehelp.com. The second rule about how to disagree in our marriages without doing terribly destructive things to each other. How to fight right. How to fight fair. How to disagree without damaging one another and undercutting the basis of trust in a relationship. The second rule of the 10 that we have outlined at marriagehelp.com goes like this. It says, I will love you just as you are. I won't make you change the person that you are. I won't force you to change your values, your personality structure, your basic underlying character of who you are. I'm going to love you just as you are now, and I'm going to appreciate and treasure the uniqueness that is you. Well, anybody that thinks about marriage for a while will realize that most people don't do that automatically. They almost instantly get into problems in their relationship. The turmoil starts. The arguments begin. The misunderstandings, one building up on top of another. I had one couple come to me one time, and I say, we've been married for almost 7.5 years. And for 7 of those 7.5 years, we've been at each other's throats continuously. We just don't believe there's any way in the world that we can overcome over 7 years of anger and meanness and bitterness and resentment. We have said some terrible things back and forth to each other. You can't be married 7 years, argued and fought the entire time almost, and recover from that. We just don't think that's possible. I did for those people the same thing I do for most of the people who come into my office. So let's just put this whole discussion on hold for a second. Let's just stop talking about how terrible everything is right now and let me get to know you just a little better. What I'd like for you to do is to go back and tell me what it was like at the beginning. What were you thinking when you first met this individual you later decided to marry? And very often I'll start with one, a husband or wife, and then transfer over to the other. I want to get an understanding of what both were seeing and feeling and thinking. And they'll start by saying something like, well, he was the most exciting person I ever met. He lived right out on the edge of life. It was thrilling to be with him. Or maybe he was the smartest guy I have ever known. He seemed to have a power to remember and to think through a problem and to sort through an issue, and he could just about figure out anything. All right? Or maybe another guy. He was the strongest young man in our entire school. He was the star of the football team. He was on the basketball team. He scored more points than anybody else in his senior year ever in our school history. He holds the record. didn't do too good in school, but he was the strongest, the most dynamic athlete that we ever had. Or he made me laugh. He seemed so carefree. He was so filled with joy. Or he was thoughtful, studious. He was a serious person. And so they go back and they tell me what they saw in this other person. And then I'll ask the husband, okay, what... I remember the first couple that I ever counseled. And I asked him the same question. What did you see in her that made you want to spend more time with her? And this farm boy from back in the farm fields had a house off the road several miles back in the cornfields, said to me, she was the most alive person I have ever seen. She danced, she laughed, she played, she was so exciting. Okay. What did you see? And others have said, she was the most beautiful girl I'd ever met. She was so radiant when she smiled. It just made my heart melt. Or another one would say, she believed in me. She made me believe in myself. All kinds of reasons. I said, okay, now, each of you have told me what you saw, how you felt. Now tell me what you hated about this individual. What drove you crazy? What just made you out of your mind crazy with who this person was? And then they'll start. And usually it'll go something like this. The one who said that he was the strongest, the most exciting athlete, will say something along the lines of, it just drove me crazy that everything he did was some sort of a competition. And he had to win every single time. Couldn't have any friends because he saw each one of them as a competitor. And he had to be the strongest, the best, the fastest of all of them. And nobody really wanted to be very close to us. Or the one that thought he was so smart and thoughtful. Well, yes, he was smart and thoughtful, but it was almost like he had no emotions inside of him. He didn't feel any passion. He didn't show any emotion. He was all closed up inside of himself. I think you can begin to see the pattern. Almost without fail, almost without exception, the very thing that drew the two of them together, that caused one to want to be a part of the life that they would share together, had a flip side to their best qualities that was most irritating, most frustrating, most mind-numbing. I'll tell you a personal story. When I started dating my wife before she was my wife, I was a very talkative individual. I know you might find that hard to believe. But I did almost all of the talking. And my wife, being more of a shy person, didn't talk a great deal. So we were married. She thought it was a good thing to be married with someone who could carry the conversation pretty much all by himself, until some time later she turned to me and she said, "You hog every conversation, no matter what situation you're in." Now, we've been married 45 years. As recently as last weekend, she turned to me again and said, "You have to give other people a chance to talk. You talk in a dominant way. People don't mind your stories, but you gotta give other people a chance to talk." 45 years married to the individual who was so thrilled with my ability to speak and to communicate and to tell stories and keep the conversation moving. And yet that very quality had the potential of driving her insane. I liked her quietness. And then sometime later, I turned to her and said, "I can't get a response out of you for anything. It's like you don't want to share your thoughts or ideas with me. You've got to think something about what I've just said. Tell me what you think." Now, 45 years later, some days I know something is stirring around in her heart and her mind. But you know what? Even to this day, it can sometimes take 2 or 3 days before it gets worked around to the point where she actually comes out and says what's bothering her. What am I trying to say? If you thought at the very beginning that the person you admired so much, that you loved so much, was so ideal for you, then why are you so upset when they actually end up being that very same person that you loved so much, but now those very qualities drive you crazy? We actually turn to each other and think, "You're about 2/3 nuts. You're so different from me. You think differently, you feel differently, you have different priorities, you have different personalities. I loved you, but you drive me to distraction." You see, that really is where most of our marriage conflicts come from. And that's why we set rule number 2. I love you just the way you are. I'm not going to change you into somebody else and expect that you are not going to you are going to behave or think or have a different style of personality. Can't happen. Those things are too deeply ingrained into us. I wish I could say to you, wives, here's the way you're going to be able to train your husbands to do things differently. I can't tell you that. I can't show you that. Why? Because there's something about who he is that's fixed. And you loved something about that person that personality, that individual. Why did you choose that individual to spend time with, to grow intimate with, to pledge your life to? I'll tell you why. You needed what they provided. That's not bad. If my wife was shy and she had a need for someone who was outgoing in order for her to have the social interaction that she could be a part of without actually having to become outgoing, it was a good thing. Through the years, she's been able to really learn how to share her own ideas a lot better. But at first, she just enjoyed my being able to lead in the interaction of our friendships and relationships. If her quietness and shyness and reservedness was important to me, why would it drive me crazy 2 years later? I knew who I married. I knew she had difficulty putting her thoughts and feelings into words. But I needed her. I needed the qualities that she brought to me. If you were attracted to the strongest athlete in the entire area, you needed that. You needed that power, that strength, the courage that it spoke about. Over and over again, I've watched it happen. People forget their first love, what they needed the most at the beginning. They forget the qualities that attracted them, that drew them together. And because they had lost that core value of what they had seen in that other individual, all that they were left with was the aggravation about how different they were than themselves. I think it's time to remember. Go back, rehearse the times that you spent together. Go backwards. Remember the first date that you went on. Remember the number of times he asked you before you decided to accept. Go back and remember your most precious experiences together. The things that just impressed you. When was it in your relationship, in the turn of your relationship, when you decided to go from just accepting being near him to where you really wanted to be married to him? What was it about her that forced you to say, I'm going to set everything else aside, I'm going to put everything else away, and I'm going to focus all my attention on her? What was it? Wasn't it the most important thing in your life at that point? Yeah. Why? Because you needed those very qualities. Now when we stop and we are having our disagreements, we're having our arguments, we're having it almost always, almost without fail, stems from the very things about that person that we loved so much that we were inescapably drawn together. And now the very differences between us cause friction. You were so convinced that this was the person for you that you stood up together and said, I will love you from this day forward without any exceptions until the day I die. That meant that that person was very, very important to you. That person was special. That person was vital to your happiness. Don't forget that. Stop right now. You may be in the biggest mess you've ever seen. Sit down. Hold hands. Touch. Sit down on the sofa next to each other. Sit down at the table and hold hands. There's something about the physical touch that has massive impact on our brains, on our emotions, on our spirit. And tell the stories to each other about what you thought and what you felt and what you desired for each other in your relationship. As you move through your datings, as you move through your engagement, as you move through those early days of married life, as you moved through the challenges of bearing children and starting the exciting part of building a family, go back and talk about what was the happiest moments in your life as you share them together. Hold each other's hand and talk about what was most miraculous about your relationship. You see, as much as we change, we really stay pretty much the same. And what you needed then, you probably still need now. And if you went back to choose somebody, and I've seen it happen many, many, many times on those second relationships, on those third relationships, they choose almost identical individuals to the qualities that they needed in their first relationship when they get to the second. What about the couple that was so angry for 7 years? Let me tell you the rest of the story. Once we had gone back and we'd remembered, and we saw what the value was for each, and they rehearsed again what it was that they needed when they began their relationship together. I said, okay, now, what about tomorrow? What are we going to do differently tomorrow? I only want to take one day at a time. So just for the day, the 24-hour span of tomorrow, I would like you to live with rule number 2. I love you just the way you are. I'm not going to ask you to make major personality changes. I'm not going to make you have a whole different set of life goals or the way you take care of priorities or business or anything. I'm going to love you just the way you are. And in that 24 hours, be nice to each other. That doesn't sound so hard, really, is it? Be nice to each other. Appreciate the other. Affirm each other. I believe in you. I trust you. I have confidence that you are a good, faithful person that I need very much in my life. And you only have to do that for 24 hours. That doesn't seem like very much of a challenge, really. But you know, something surprising happens at the end of 24 hours. When there's no argument, there's no fight, there's no belittling, there's no, snide little attacks on the character of the other. You tend to remember that the day went pretty well. And your memory begins to fade about all those years and all those previous arguments. And instead of remembering all 7 years of all of that hassle and all of that nastiness and all that anger and all that betrayal, it just seems to fade. And you maybe only remember about 6.5 years worth of that bad stuff. And at the end of the first 24 hours, we look at the next 24 hours and we say, okay, now that worked pretty well for one day. If I can be nice for 124 hours, I can be pleasant, I can turn aside my anger for 124-hour day, maybe I can do it for 2. You may not be able to, you may have to have a bad day in between, but when you start that next day, say, I'm going to try this again. And after you've had 2 good days, you only remember maybe 5 years of that bad stuff. And after you've been able to put back 4, 5, 6 days of getting along and enjoying each other's company and having it safe where you're not always on edge wondering what the next attack's going to come from, and you may only remember maybe a year of that 7 years of bad stuff. And after you've had 10 days of enjoyable, safe, comfortable relationship, you will not remember anything of those 7 years. It would have been as though they faded away. The only thing that keeps their memory alive is the ongoing struggle that's pulling us apart. The only thing that keeps those memories painful is the ongoing pain that we couldn't deal with before.